Justin, and Justin called me and says, it's it, get it. So that's how we validated initially that this was the real McCoy. So, okay, so we got the bike, everything's fine. Oh, so then John tells me, I said, John, you know, was it easy getting this bike and all from the factory? How did you get this bike from the factory being the last one? He says, well, we had a deal with the factory that we bought 8 of these TSSs, and he says they were coming into the distributorship in California. He says, and we made sure that this one was in the batch when it came in. I said, oh, great. He says, but it wasn't there. He said, when they took the manifest out and they looked at it, this particular bike was not there. He called back to the factory, and you can imagine at this point in time, it's in disarray. People are losing their jobs. You know, they're going out of their minds. So he says, where's this bike at? And they said, well, he checked this. He said, it was shipped to Louisiana. And so he called the distributor in Louisiana, and the guy says, oh, it's been sent out to a dealership. Where? Baton Rouge. So he called the dealership up, and he said, oh, it's been sold. And they gave him the name of the guy. And he called him up, and he said, this guy's name is Rodney Peloso. And he called him up, good old boy in the backcountry kind of guy. And he said, you know you have the last Triumph ever made? And he says, I don't care. And he said, well, I'll give you a brand new one if you traded me for it. He says, I don't need a brand new one. I got a brand new one. I'm driving it. And so John's going, holy mackerel, how am I going to get this bike? And he says, well, look, he says, I'll tell you what, I'll trade you a brand new one. He says, and I'll fly you to California so that we can make the trade. And Rodney goes, you'll fly me? He says, yeah. He says, I've never been on a plane before in my life. That was it. Got him. All right. So he flies to California. They ship the bike out. They make the switch. They send the new one back with Rodney, or ship it back. Rodney flies back. So John's got this bike. So that's how he ended up getting the first one. So this sat in John's living room for 15 years until he sold it to me.
Wow.
So now this is in 1998. So I've got this letter from VMCC saying this is the last Bonneville, the last Triumph, blah blah blah, all of this. About a year later, I get this. I get a flyer from the London Motorcycle Museum. Who was I talking with about that? You.
Yep.
Yeah, London Motorcycle Museum. They've got this TSS, which you've seen.
Yep.
And it says the last Triumph out of Meriden. And I'm going, what? So I write him a letter and I say, hey, here's all the documentation. We've really got the last one here. You guys don't have it. So I never hear back from these people. So my wife and I go to Europe pretty regularly. So I said, we're going to stop, and I'm going to the museum. So I went in as nobody. I didn't tell them who I was or anything. And here's this TSS sitting there, and the wife of the curator, the owner, I said, okay, now I'm going to get the story, right? So I just said, well, this says it's the last Triumph out of Meriden. Does that mean it's the last production bike? And she goes, no. I said, well, what does that mean? She says, well, my husband was the sales director at Triumph, and this was the demo bike that they took to all the shows and everything. And when they closed the factory, this is the last bike they wheeled out the gate. So I guess it's all how you.
That's just a story.
Okay, so she's right. She's right. I said, okay. So I didn't tell her anything, so I wasn't worried about that one. So about another year goes by, and I get a call from my friend Terry Clark. He says, "Hey, wait, I'm looking back in this Classic Bikes magazine." He says, and I see where the last Triumph ever made was sold to this dealership in London, Roebuck's. So he sent me a copy of the article, and here it was. It was the last Triumph. It says certified to be the last Triumph made. Went to Roebuck's, and so I called up the VMCC. I said, "What's going on here?" And they said, "Oh, we know about that bike. That bike was made up of parts. They had 3 engines left over, and I've got all the documentation that shows the 3 engines. That's one of the engines. They took it. They took some of the old parts. They had some of the guys come back in. They manufactured this bike." So this bike here was made in January 21st of 1983. That bike was made in June of 1983, and they sold this bike to the dealership. When they realized they didn't have this bike anymore, they made that one up and they sold it to a dealership with a letter certifying it's the last Triumph ever made. Now it depends again. Was it? I think the last production bike is really what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
That's what this is.
Mhm.
So anyway, so the people at VMCC got so tired of listening to me that they sent me copies of all the records, and I have them in the file now. I have everything, and it's unbelievable that it says right, it says right there that this is the last one. And David Galen even had it wrong in his book. He had the last one listed as a TR6, and so I proved to David that he was wrong, that this is the last bike. And so he's just reissued his new book, and it's got the correct information. Credit to him. He argued with me for a long time because he didn't think he doesn't think he's wrong, but he was. So that's how we ended. Now we know what we have. So about 3 years ago, my wife and I were talking about this bike sitting here in this private collection where guys like you can see it, but nobody else can. And I said, I'm going to go back and let's go to England and we'll go to the National Motorcycle Museum and I'll offer them the bike. Because by that time they had bought this Robux bike. They had the one that was a fake on display.
I just said I do, or trade them for something, right?
No, I wouldn't. No, I'd give it to them. I'd even pay the shipping. I don't care. I mean, I felt that this bike
A
needed
piece
to
of
be
history,
back.
right.
Yeah. So I went and I met with Mick Duckworth, who wrote all the books and stuff, and he was the assistant curator now. And I said, Mick, I got this bike. I said, it's the real one. Guys don't have the real one. I'll give it to you. Told them the whole story. They didn't want it.
Oh.
And the reason they didn't want it was because they had their story. How are you gonna say, oh, we got the real last one now, when you've been advertising this for 5 or 6 years that this was the So I gave up on those guys. I said so anyway, so this bike is going to go. Has anybody been to the Barber Motorsports Museum?
Yeah, twice.
For this when I'm dead. So we've already made plans with Brian Slark down there. He's the curator. They're gonna take this and the deal. All we really ever wanted was to be put on prominent display. We just want to have our name that we donated it. My wife and I donated this, and that's what I told the guys in England. I said that's all we want to do. We just want you to put our name on it. That we donated it to your museum, and those guys did.
So after
Keep it
83,
here. Keep
there
it
was
here.